Hi guys, we are into a second last session on our series through Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. We've got one more to go next week. This week we are looking at the first part of Matthew 7, verses 1 to 12. As always, if you haven't had a chance to read it, please have a look first. The passage is actually packed with stuff, and I can only get to some of it in the time that we've got here today. So I was actually quite excited in a nerdy way when I realized which passage we were getting to this week, because within this portion of scripture there's two passages which many of you will know really well or have heard used, quoted many times. And I was interested to see whether what we've learned in the Sermon on the Mount will help us have a better view of them or understand the context a bit better, and hopefully help us be able to reference them in future more accurately. And so the full reading includes 3 cautions. That's why that's been bundled together, even though we could probably do each one as a separate item. But there are 3 cautions, and they're placed intentionally at the back end of the Sermon on the Mount. And the preceding teaching will hopefully help us understand what Jesus is going for, which, hopefully a helpful exercise for these 2 very well-known passages. Let's jump in. Chapter 7, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, and with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite! First take the plank out of your own eye, then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. And then finally, do not give dogs what is sacred, do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them underfoot and turn and tear you to pieces. So the first caution, undoubtedly, is the risk of us living in an unhealthy judgment of others. Now, all of us know very well the human inclination to judge, whether it be people's personal behavior or the way that they spend their money, their parenting, maybe even their dress sense. We make a lot of assessments about other people. As we work through the Sermon on the Mount, though, we've seen repeatedly Jesus pointing to an inauthentic, works-based version of holiness as the underlying issue in the culture of the day. And so he's pointed to examples of people carrying malice in their hearts, even though they haven't actually, acted on that or attacked or murdered someone. Similarly, the way people carry and entertain lust in their minds, though they may not have committed adultery. They've managed to sort of keep from acting on it. There are also examples of people praying ostentatiously on the street corners or making a fuss about their generosity. And I think that this contrast, this underlying issue, helps us understand the sin as a speck of sawdust, it says, versus the plank in people's eyes. The leaders of the day were inflicting ever greater rules and restrictions on the practices of the Jews. But they were living without any of the poverty of spirit that we see Jesus pointing to as the primary entry point into God's kingdom. There was no grace, there was no mercy, there was no hungering and thirst for righteousness. There was a lot of finger pointing and a lot of rules and a lot of delineation based on actions, what was considered holy and what was not. Jesus is trying to get to the heart of things. And so I think that for me has been a helpful thought. I've always wondered, and he points to the plank in someone's eye and the speck of sawdust. Is he saying that sin in your life is more serious than sin in someone else's life? Or why the difference in the scale there? But I think I believe coming out of this message, what he's saying is an inauthentic submission to God or an inauthentic attempt at holiness is like having a plank in our eye, and the little details that we start to point out in people's lives are the specks, are the things that are far less of concern to Jesus. So that is by far the weight of the passage. I do want to just very briefly mention two other thoughts coming out of this particular part. In the example of the log and the splinter, there is also evidence of an appropriate time where it's right to bring correction to another believer. And so I think the risk of this passage is reading it as a ban on any sort of correction or confession or accountability, what is effectively like just good discipleship of people. And so I think we just need to log that, and that's something that we've talked about quite a bit as a community in the past. And I think adding weight to that, we can see verse 6 as a caution that, talks about there are times when someone is so opposed to biblical wisdom or correction that bringing that correction is almost like throwing pearls to pigs. And so I think that just adds weight to the idea that correction in itself is not the problem. Inauthenticity is the problem. And then obviously recognizing whether it will be fruitful or not when you bring it is important. So those are just two final thoughts. The weight of the passage, as I said, absolutely suggests that pride is the biggest issue. And I'm sure we probably all agree with that. But yeah, we can't miss the last two suggestions of discernment having its place. And I was reminded of our work in Peter 1 and 2. Peter called it being sober-minded when he wrote to the churches in Asia about teachers who were promoting a spirituality which was really just serving human nature and not God. And so we'll definitely get into this in the discussion time, like how and when is it appropriate to bring correction. So we've touched on the first two cautions here, the risk of judgment, living out your faith inauthentically, the still need, though not the primary emphasis on correctly using discernment. And the third thing is the need for persistence. And that's where we get into the ask, seek, knock portion. The final part of the scripture concerns the need to persist in our pursuit of righteousness and devotion to God. So Jesus has laid out over 2 chapters a vision for the kingdom. He's highlighted kingdom principles. He's pointed to the risk of inauthenticity. But in his opening statement, in his first beatitude, it's for all disciples primarily to possess a poverty of spirit. Effort alone will not be enough to fulfill this vision for our lives, right? God actually has to give it to us. And so his prescription is ask, seek, knock, not try, and try again. It's a call to persistence in prayer. There's a quote from D.A. Carson in the commentary I've been working from here, which I think is helpful to us in this moment. He's talking about what he calls the flash in the pan disciple. This idea that like we can encounter truth, but do we fall in love with the truth itself, or do we start to see ourselves in light of the truth that we encounter? So he says, now this flash in the pan disciple who has been motivated by high sentiment and noble thought and has somehow entirely missed the significance of the first beatitude. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This disciple is riding high on his determination, his own recently stimulated lofty ideals. Incredibly, the Sermon on the Mount makes him think he can live by its precepts all by himself, instead of seeing his own spiritual bankruptcy in light of the Sermon on the Mount. Instead of that, he sees only the beauty of the light itself. And therefore, instead of turning to God and asking for grace and mercy and forgiveness and acceptance and the help which his spiritually bankrupt state requires, he merely turns over a new leaf. Small wonder he is soon discouraged and defeated. Jesus' audience was well acquainted with a system of holiness that traded in effort and performance. And we've seen week after week that this is the opposite of what he actually wanted, right? What he wants is a contrite heart and a shedding of pride and disciples who will pursue him with a right view of ourselves and a right view of God. Not just an appreciation for the values and the teaching which he presents, but actually recognizing ourselves in light of those things. And when we do that, verse 9, the promise says, which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? But if you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? And so the promise is, if we will persist, not in our own strength, but if we will humbly persist and ask God to draw us towards him, to grow these values in our lives and to give us the what we need to live it out. He's saying, if you will ask, I will give it to you. So that's what we need to bank coming out of the Sermon on the Mount. It was always going to be a challenge. There's so many parts of this message where it feels like we're just being called to a higher standard of living, but we must hold on to the humility before the Lord and the promises like this that say, if we come before God with this posture, this heart disposition, he is the one who actually, through the power of the Spirit, grows these things in our lives. Think about it this week. We'll chat more on Thursday, get as practical as we can, and then we'll finish up next week. Love you guys, and look forward to seeing you soon. Cheers.